Hey everyone. Tonight we're drifting back to the Middle Ages. So, get comfortable, let the light from your screen soften. And if your pillow is lumpy, imagine it's a velvet cushion stolen from a medieval noble's bedchamber. We'll be gliding through the quiet corridors of history, exploring what happened when a child was born inconveniently. And by inconveniently, of course, I mean illegitimately. Because in medieval Europe, illegitimacy was a bit like an uninvited dinner guest who arrives loudly, eats everything on the table, and then insists on being added to the inheritance. Nobody wanted to deal with it, but it happened constantly. Royal courts whispered about it. Villagers gossiped about it. The church frowned at it, officially, while bishops and priests contributed generously to the problem in practice. And ordinary people who were not exactly paragons of chastity found themselves in the awkward situation of raising a child who, legally speaking, wasn't supposed to exist. So, how exactly did medieval people try to hide illegitimate children? Well, the answer is creatively, desperately, and sometimes rather poorly. Let's drift into that world together. The first thing to understand is that illegitimacy carried a heavy price. Not just a social stain, but actual, tangible consequences. A child labeled a bastard couldn't inherit noble lands or titles. They couldn't legally climb into the royal succession. They were shut out of most forms of respectability. Now you might think, surely people in the Middle Ages were more forgiving. After all, everyone was dying of plague, famine, or some sort of mystery rash. Who cared about a little dalliance? But no, medieval Europe was obsessed with lineage. Bloodlines were currency. Dynasties were fragile. And a badly timed child could throw an entire kingdom into chaos. This meant that nobles, royals, and ambitious families had powerful reasons to pretend certain children didn't exist. Or, if they did exist, that they belonged to someone else. And so began the long tradition of shuffling children around like slightly embarrassing heirlooms. One of the most common strategies was the convent drop-off. If a woman gave birth to an inconvenient baby, she could place the child at a monastery or convent. Some institutions even installed something called a foundling wheel. Picture a wooden barrel or rotating hatch in the wall, where desperate mothers could place an infant, turn the wheel, and voila, the baby appeared inside, safely on the church's side. A medieval baby delivery system, anonymous, quiet, and in theory, charitable. Of course, once inside, the child would be raised by monks or nuns. They might be cared for with gentle devotion, or neglected with the indifference of overworked clergy who already had more orphans than they could feed. Records suggest both outcomes were common, and the parents, they could walk away, their secret technically preserved. Though one suspects village gossip was often quicker than the wheel itself. For wealthier families, especially nobles, the convent solution was sometimes dressed up as something more respectable. They would donate the child to the religious life, as if little Geoffrey, aged 2, had already declared a burning passion for monastic silence. Naturally, he hadn't, but cloister walls made excellent barriers against scandal. There's also the wet nurse solution. If a noblewoman wanted to erase the evidence, she might send the baby to live with a peasant family far from court. The foster parents would raise the child as their own. Payment was sometimes generous, sometimes meek, and occasionally the family was told absolutely nothing about the child's origins. Imagine being handed a baby with a pouch of coins and a polite request never to ask questions. Some of those children never returned to their birth families. Others were quietly reintegrated later, introduced as distant cousins or wards. The medieval nobility had a remarkable ability to invent relatives when it suited them, of course. Sometimes parents tried the boldest strategy of all, outright denial. The child would be raised within the household, but with a carefully edited identity. Servants might whisper, neighbors might guess, but officially, the baby was someone else's. Perhaps the child of a maid, or a relative, or a passing merchant who had conveniently vanished. The problem with this approach is that human beings, unfortunately, resemble their parents. So when the supposed servant's child looked alarmingly like the local lord, explanations grew thin. Medieval chroniclers loved these little resemblances, and they gleefully recorded them. Ah, yes, they would write, the boy bore the unmistakable nose of his father, whom everyone pretended was not his father. Now, when it came to kings, the problem became more theatrical, because kings had mistresses, and mistresses had children. Lots of them. Take Henry I of England, for instance. He had so many illegitimate children that chroniclers lost count. 24 is the most common figure, but it might have been more. At some point, one imagines, Henry simply stopped pretending they were distant cousins. But not every king could be so open. For those who wanted discretion, there were elaborate children might be placed in distant monasteries, educated, and then reintroduced into society as loyal courtiers. A way of keeping them useful without ever admitting where they came from, of course. This didn't always prevent them from meddling. Illegitimate royal children had a terrible habit of resurfacing at awkward political moments, usually with armies. But that's a drifting thought we'll circle back to later. For ordinary people, hiding an illegitimate child was often more desperate. Peasant women couldn't afford convent donations or hired wet nurses. Their options were limited to secrecy, denial, or abandonment. Medieval law codes are filled with grim references to infants left in fields, doorways, and riverbanks. Some of those children were rescued. Many were not. It's a sobering reminder that illegitimacy was not just a matter of embarrassment, but of survival. And yet, in communities where everyone knew everyone else, complete secrecy was nearly impossible. The village would know, the neighbors would whisper, and so women sometimes resorted to inventing elaborate excuses. Oh, this baby. He's my cousin's son, visiting for a while. Yes, my cousin from the next village. You don't know her. She's very real. Please stop asking questions. Interestingly, the church itself played a double role. On the one hand, it loudly condemned illegitimacy. On the other, it quietly provided systems for dealing with it. Convents, foundling hospitals, even special rites for secretly baptizing unwanted children. It was as if the church was scolding everyone for their sins, while simultaneously running a discreet medieval childcare service. one gets the sense that the priests and bishops knew exactly how frequent the problem was, and considering many of them had their own illegitimate children, the hypocrisy was as thick as monastery porridge. Sometimes illegitimacy was hidden not to protect the child, but to protect the inheritance. A nobleman might have legitimate sons and illegitimate sons, and if the bastards were acknowledged too openly, legitimate heirs could feel threatened. So, the illegitimate ones were pushed aside, shuffled into monasteries, sent abroad, or tucked into distant manors, close enough to use, far enough not to claim too much. In this sense, illegitimate children were like chess pieces, disposable, but occasionally quite useful if you moved them carefully. What strikes me most, drifting through these stories, is how universal the problem was. Kings, queens, bishops, peasants, everyone was involved. The rules were strict, but human nature was not. And so, medieval society built a whole shadow system: wills, convents, false parentage, denials to manage the inevitable, and the children themselves. Some vanished into anonymity. Some rose to prominence despite the stain of their birth, and some simply lived quiet, forgotten lives, carrying the weight of secrets they never asked for. So, how did people in medieval times hide illegitimate children? By pretending, by shuffling, by lying politely, by leaving them at monastery doors and calling it charity, by declaring them orphans, cousins, wards, or distant relatives, by denying what was obvious to anyone with eyes. It was messy. It was cruel at times. It was pragmatic at others. And above all, it was very, very human. Let's drift a little further. Next time, into what became of those children when they weren't hidden quite so successfully. Hey everyone, welcome back. We're still drifting through the quiet world of medieval illegitimacy. Last time, we explored the many ways people tried to hide inconvenient babies. Tonight, let's imagine what happened when those children couldn't be tucked away so neatly. Because the truth is, secrecy has a terrible flaw. It rarely lasts. Neighbors gossip, servants talk, mistresses boast, and before long, the child you wanted to pretend didn't exist is suddenly at the center of everyone's attention. So, what happened then? Well, the answer depended heavily on your station in life. If you were a peasant, it meant some awkward years of being pointed at in the village square. If you were a noble, it could mean dynastic wars, which, frankly, feels like overreacting. But medieval Europe was very committed to overreacting. First, let's consider the legal side. Illegitimate children were considered fili nullius, children of no one. A bleak title. It meant they had no claim to their father's inheritance, no automatic rights, and no social standing unless someone powerful chose to recognize them. The church was absolutely delighted by this arrangement. It could wag its finger at everyone, proclaiming that bastards had no place in noble succession, while quietly granting legitimization papers. For the right donation, of course. The medieval papacy, pious with one hand, entrepreneurial with the other. So, an illegitimate child could be legally erased, or legally upgraded, depending on who was paying and praying. For ordinary villagers, being illegitimate was mostly a lifetime of side-eye. People remembered, they whispered, even if everyone in town was secretly related in questionable ways. The label of bastard stuck like burrs on Waldot. Such children might grow up working the land, apprenticed to trades, or shuffled into monasteries where their origins were less of a scandal. The church, after all, never minded free labor. Some even found themselves useful as scapegoats. If a family needed to explain away a particularly bad harvest or an unlucky year, well, having a bastard around provided an easy culprit. It was cruel, but medieval life wasn't known for its sensitivity training. Now, things looked very different if you were the illegitimate child of royalty. Because while the church insisted you couldn't inherit the throne, history is filled with exceptions, loopholes, and outright defiance. Kings, it turned out, had a terrible habit of acknowledging their illegitimate children when it suited them, and then, naturally, disowning them again when it did, single quotes, to take William the Conqueror. He was famously illegitimate. His rivals mocked him as William the Bastard. Not a particularly creative insult, but effective enough. And yet, he conquered England anyway, which just goes to show legitimacy was important. Until you had an army, Henry I of England, whom we floated past earlier, had so many illegitimate children that it's a wonder the royal court didn't resemble a daycare. But here's the strange thing. He acknowledged them, openly. He arranged marriages for them, gave them lands, and used them as political pawns. Because why waste good offspring just because of technicalities? The irony, of course, is that Henry's one legitimate son died in the White Ship disaster, leaving him with a fleet of bastards, none of whom could legally inherit. The result? Civil war, because of course it was so. The very system designed to prevent illegitimate children from becoming too powerful ended up plunging the kingdom into chaos. When the legitimate line collapsed, other monarchs took different approaches. Some hid their illegitimate offspring as carefully as possible, planting them in monasteries where they could never trouble the succession. Others embraced them shamelessly, parading them at court as if scandal were a form of jewelry. The French kings were particularly enthusiastic about this. Louis XIV, the Sun King, openly legitimized several of his children by mistresses. He even gave them titles. And while technically we're drifting a bit beyond the medieval period there, the habit was hardly new. In short, illegitimacy mattered, unless the king decided it didn't. For noble families lower on the food chain, things were more precarious. A baron's illegitimate son could be quietly useful as a knight or soldier, loyal precisely because his social status was precarious. But if that son grew ambitious, things could turn awkward quickly. There are plenty of medieval chronicles recording feuds where half-brothers legitimate and illegitimate ended up fighting bloody battles over land. Sometimes the bastards won, sometimes they didn't, and sometimes the entire family line collapsed under the weight of its own tangled secrets. But let's drift back to the children themselves. What was it like to grow up with that label? Well, medieval sources don't often tell us. because chroniclers were usually more interested in who married whom than in how children actually felt. Still, we can guess. Imagine being reminded constantly that you didn't fully belong. Not in your father's house, not in the inheritance, not even, in some cases, in the parish record books. It must have been a lonely place, one where identity itself was shaky, where your very existence was considered inconvenient. And yet, some of these children flourished anyway. They became brilliant soldiers, cunning administrators, even beloved figures. It seems illegitimacy didn't erase talent. It only complicated it. One of the quiet ironies is that illegitimate children were often healthier than legitimate ones. Why? Because noble families practiced generations of inbreeding, while illegitimate children, born from affairs with less closely related partners, sometimes had sturdier constitutions. So, the very children the dynasty tried to ignore might actually have been its best shot at survival. But of course, practicality rarely triumphed over pride. So the bastards were left in the shadows, while pale, sickly legitimate heirs coughed their way onto thrones. History is nothing if not ironic. So, what happened when the secret slipped out? Illegitimate children could be ignored, mocked, or erased. They could be used, legitimized, or even elevated. Their lives swung wildly depending on the whims of powerful parents and the needs of dynastic politics. But whatever path they took, one thing was constant. They were reminders of human weakness, of desire, of secrecy, of mistakes, of hypocrisy. And medieval society, so obsessed with rules and appearances, could never quite decide whether to punish them, use them, or quietly pretend they weren't there. Let's drift a little further next time into the strange, ironic stories of the most famous illegitimate children in medieval history. Hey everyone, welcome back. We're still floating through the quiet, slightly awkward corridors of illegitimacy. We've wandered past the ways children were hidden, and we've peeked at what happened when the secret spilled out. Now let's settle in and drift through a few lives of the most famous illegitimate children in medieval Europe. Because for every child quietly dropped at a convent door, there were others who clawed their way into chronicles, courts, and occasionally thrones. And their stories tell us a lot about just how blurry the line between bastard and heir could really be. Let's begin with one of the most famous of all, William the Conqueror. Born around 1028 in Normandy, he was the son of Duke Robert I and his mistress, Helena. Not exactly a promising start for someone destined to invade England. His nickname as a young man was William the Bastard, because medieval nobles were not subtle. They saw no need to invent flowery insults when a blunt one would do, and it stuck with him, right up until he acquired a slightly more impressive title, William the Conqueror, which, you'll agree, has a better ring to it. William's illegitimacy dogged him as a boy. When his father died, Norman nobles hesitated to follow a child who technically had no right to exist in polite society. Several tried to overthrow him, but William survived assassination attempts, rebellions, and more than one noble tantrum. By adulthood, he had turned the bastard into a badge of stubborn survival, and when he crossed the Channel in 1066, and seized England, no one dared call him illegitimate anymore. At least, not to his face. The lesson was clear. Illegitimacy mattered until you had sharp swords and better luck than your rivals. Now, let's drift over to another English king, Henry I. We mentioned him earlier, but his prolific contribution to illegitimacy deserves more than a passing glance. Henry was the youngest son of William the Conqueror, and he inherited his father's robust survival instinct. Unlike his father, however, Henry embraced illegitimacy not as a burden, but as a hobby. He sired at least 24 illegitimate children, possibly more. Chroniclers eventually stopped counting. What's fascinating is that Henry didn't hide them. He acknowledged them openly, gave them noble marriages, and placed them in useful positions. His daughters married into powerful families across England and Normandy. His sons became earls, barons, and knights. In other words, he turned his bastards into a political network. It was a clever strategy, until his only legitimate son drowned in the White Ship disaster, at which point Henry's carefully built dynasty suddenly hinged on his daughter Matilda. And if you know anything about medieval barons, you'll know they weren't exactly enthusiastic about being ruled by a woman. Result: civil war, known charmingly as the Anarchy, all because Henry had too many children, just not the right kind. Next, let's drift to France, where the kings had an equally complicated relationship with their illegitimate offspring. Take Philip II of France, sometimes called Philip Augustus, a capable king, clever, pragmatic, and like his peers, rather fond of extracurricular activities. He fathered several illegitimate children, whom he acknowledged with a kind of casual indifference. For Philip, illegitimacy was less a scandal than an administrative inconvenience. The children were there, they existed, and he arranged their lives accordingly. Because when you're the king of France, what exactly is anyone going to say? And yet, despite this royal tolerance, illegitimate children remained stuck with their peculiar half-status. They could be loved, used, even married well, but they could never quite sit comfortably on the throne itself. Across the Channel once more, we find Geoffrey Plantagenet, one of Henry II of England's illegitimate brood. Geoffrey became Archbishop of York, not because of deep religious devotion, but because his father needed to place his sons somewhere useful. One went into the church, one became a soldier, one became a schemer. It was like a medieval family career fair. Geoffrey was notorious for fighting with his half-brothers, especially King John. And while you might think an archbishop would focus on prayer, Geoffrey's life was filled with lawsuits, property disputes, and spectacular arguments, because medieval churchmen often behaved less like saints and more like cranky landlords. Still, he wielded significant power, all while carrying the label of illegitimacy. Then there's John of Gaunt's children in the 14th century. John, Duke of Lancaster, was one of the most powerful men in England. He had several illegitimate children with his mistress Catherine Swynford. These children, the Beauforts, were later legitimized by royal decree, but with one very important clause. They were barred from inheriting the throne. That clause would be conveniently ignored by John's descendants, because generations later, The Beaufort line would help justify the claim of the Tudors. Yes, the Tudors, those melodramatic monarchs who gave us Henry VIII and his unfortunate wives. So, in a way, England's most infamous dynasty owed its crown partly to the blurred line of medieval illegitimacy. Let's not forget Alfonso XI of Castile, a Spanish king who had a legitimate queen, and also a mistress named Leonor de Guzman. Together, Alfonso and Leonor had 10 children, 10, all illegitimate. He adored Leonor and showered her with power, while his poor wife, Maria of Portugal, was largely ignored, which was awkward given that Maria's son, Peter, was supposed to inherit the throne. When Alfonso died, Maria finally seized her revenge. She had Leonor imprisoned and executed, because medieval dynastic disputes often ended in ways that were not, shall we say, healthy co-parenting. Leonor's children, however, survived, and they became the powerful Trastamara family, who eventually claimed the Castilian throne. So once again, illegitimacy turned out not to be a dead end, but rather a detour with sharp daggers along the way. And then there's the awkward case of legitimization rituals. Sometimes kings went to great lengths to launder their illegitimate offspring. They would issue royal decrees, hold ceremonies, or secure papal approval. But legitimization was always a bit of a gamble. It worked, until it didn't. Political enemies could always revive the old insult. Legitimized was never quite the same as legitimate. So what do we see in all these stories? Illegitimate children could be mocked, dismissed, and barred from succession. But they could also become conquerors, archbishops, dynastic founders, and even royal ancestors. The contradiction is striking. Officially, illegitimacy was a stain. Unofficially, it was just another part of dynastic politics. Useful when needed, discarded when not. It makes you wonder how many medieval nobles looked around their courts, filled with cousins, nephews, and distant relatives, and quietly admitted to themselves that half the family tree was, well, slightly blurred as we drift to the end of these stories. Perhaps the lesson is this: medieval illegitimate children lived in the space between rejection and necessity, never fully accepted, never entirely erased, forever walking that delicate line where scandal met opportunity in history. As usual, couldn't quite decide whether to forget them or build kingdoms on their shoulders. Let's float a little further next time, into the everyday world of illegitimacy, how midwives, neighbors, and village priests all became reluctant guardians of other people's secrets. Hey everyone, welcome back. We've wandered through the scandalous halls of royal bastards, kings who couldn't keep count of their children, and dynasties that quietly bent the rules. Now, let's soften the focus, because most illegitimate children weren't born in castles. They were born in cottages, in towns, in villages where everyone knew your name, your business, and probably your laundry schedule. And in that world, the question wasn't how to hide a bastard from the Pope. It was how to keep your neighbors from whispering about you at the market. The first line of secrecy was almost always the midwife. Medieval midwives weren't just birth attendants. They were guardians of reputation. keepers of secrets, and occasionally reluctant accessories to quiet scandals. If a woman gave birth out of wedlock, the midwife was often the only other person present who knew for certain. She could lie. She could fudge the timing. She could even declare the baby stillborn and quietly remove the evidence. Some midwives became skilled negotiators in these delicate situations, balancing the demands of families, the suspicions of priests, and the quiet desperation of mothers. And of course, if the midwife talked, the whole village would know by morning. So choosing one's midwife carefully was almost as important as choosing one's husband then. There was the matter of community gossip. Villages were small, tight-knit, and observant. If a young woman suddenly disappeared for a few months, returned looking tired, and there happened to be a suspiciously timed orphan raised by her aunt, people noticed. Gossip was the oxygen of medieval communities. Everyone participated. It was entertainment, moral policing, and social glue all rolled into one. So, hiding an illegitimate child was less about the actual baby, and more about managing the endless chatter. This meant mothers and families often invented elaborate stories. The child was a cousin's. The child was adopted. The child belonged to travelers passing through who had tragically died of plague. And everyone, of course, nodded politely while not believing a single word. For poorer families, the problem was simpler, if crueler. They often couldn't afford the scandal or the extra mouth to feed. So illegitimate babies were sometimes abandoned, left at church doors, placed in baskets by roadsides, handed over to strangers with little more than hope. It sounds shocking to us, but in the grinding poverty of a medieval village, survival was the calculation. A child who might drag the whole family down was, in their harsh arithmetic, better left elsewhere, and yet there are touching records too. Parish accounts noting villagers who took in abandoned children, raised them, and gave them names, because alongside the cruelty there was also compassion, quiet, unsung, everyday kindness. The church again played a curious role here. Priests were supposed to uphold morality, to denounce fornication, illegitimacy, and all the rest. But priests were also, inconveniently, human, and a fair number of them had their own illegitimate children tucked away in villages. So, in practice, many parish priests turned a blind eye. They baptized illegitimate infants, sometimes with a muttered apology to the church register. They allowed them into parish life. They scolded in sermons, yes, but privately. They often helped cover things up. It was hypocrisy, yes, but also, perhaps, a small mercy. We should also talk about the wet nurses. Noble families used them to farm out infants, but villagers did too, in their own way. A baby might be loaned to another family, with everyone pretending it wasn't the real mother's child. The baby would grow up as part of a different household, sometimes knowing the truth, sometimes not. In a world where record-keeping was minimal, identities could be flexible. This created generations of people who may have suspected their real parentage, but never knew for certain, because no one told them, and because asking too many questions was considered impolite, or even dangerous. the everyday reality of illegitimacy was also shaped by law. In many towns, being illegitimate restricted your career. You couldn't hold certain offices. You couldn't inherit guild memberships easily, and you were always, in some way, marked as less. But here's the irony. In practice, communities often valued ability more than legality. If an illegitimate man was hard-working, skilled, and loyal, he could rise within a guild, even if the rules frowned on it. If a woman was industrious and capable, her background mattered less than her usefulness. So while the law sneered, life went on with practical compromises. And what of the children themselves? How did they see the world? We can only guess, because few illegitimate peasants left behind memoirs. But their lives were likely shaped by a constant tension between acceptance and exclusion. In some households, they were loved as fully as any child. In others, they were reminded daily of their shameful origins. It depended less on law, and more on the kindness or cruelty of the families who raised them. And perhaps that's the most human part of this story. Not the dynastic quarrels of kings, but the quiet choices of ordinary people deciding whether to treat a child as a burden, a secret, or simply as a child. So, while royal bastards grabbed headlines and armies, village bastards lived quieter, humbler lives. Their fates rested not in papal bulls or royal decrees, but in the hands of midwives, neighbors, and families trying to balance shame with survival. It's a reminder that history is often less about kings, and more about the small negotiations of ordinary people trying to get by. Next time, let's drift back up the ladder again, and explore how illegitimate children sometimes became powerful weapons in dynastic politics, used as pawns, bargaining chips, and even claims to thrones. Hey everyone, welcome back. So far, we've watched illegitimate children arrive in secret, slip into villages, or stumble awkwardly into royal courts. But let's be honest, medieval politics was rarely about affection. It was about power, and illegitimate children, for all their stigma, could be surprisingly useful pieces on the dynastic chessboard. Because while you couldn't always seat them on a throne, you could certainly marry them off, deploy them as allies, or unleash them as rivals. And as we'll see, a bastard with ambition was sometimes more dangerous than a prince with pedigree. Let's begin with the marriage market. Royal bastards were often married strategically to bind lesser nobles to the crown. A king's illegitimate daughter might be given to a loyal knight or baron as a reward. The knight gained prestige. He was now tied to the royal family, and the king gained a useful ally. It was a kind of dynastic recycling program. These daughters couldn't be used to cement grand alliances with other kingdoms. That was a job for legitimate princesses. But they could certainly keep local nobles happy. And in a world where half of politics was stopping barons from rebelling, this was quite practical. Then there was the matter of sons. Illegitimate sons couldn't inherit the throne, usually, but they could be excellent military commanders. In fact, many kings happily sent their bastards off to war, where they could earn fame without threatening the succession directly. William the Conqueror's sons followed this pattern. Henry II pushed his illegitimate sons into earldoms, knightly orders, and military commands. They were loyal, ambitious, and often grateful for the recognition. And nothing binds a man to you quite like reminding him that you could have left him nameless in a village, but instead gave him armor, a title, and an income. Of course, sometimes this backfired. Give a bastard too much power, and suddenly they start to think they deserve more. It's the medieval equivalent of giving your intern the company credit card, and then finding out they've launched a hostile takeover. Take the case of the Beaufort family again. John of Gaunt's children by Catherine's. At first, they were just useful pawns, married off into noble families, helping to extend Lancaster influence. But once legitimized, the Beauforts developed ambitions of their own. Generations later, Margaret Beaufort's son would become Henry VII, and suddenly, the useful pawns had transformed into kings. It's a reminder that in politics, even a pawn can reach the other side of the board. Although, in this case, it took about a century and several bloody wars to get there. In France, illegitimate children often became churchmen or courtiers. Kings would appoint their sons to bishoprics or abbeys, securing both income and influence. It's worth remembering that medieval bishops were less spiritual shepherds and more wealthy administrators with armies. So, handing an illegitimate son a bishopric was like giving him a fief with added incense, and once again, loyalty was the real currency. A bastard bishop owed everything to his father, which meant, in theory, he could be trusted. Though, as with most family dynamics, theory and practice were often miles apart. One of the most striking political uses of bastards came in the 100 Years' War. Both England and France had armies filled with illegitimate royal sons. They fought for their fathers, their half-brothers, and sometimes against them, because in the chaos of war, a bastard could switch sides if offered enough power. They were valuable, but unpredictable. Imagine being a legitimate heir, trying to assert your authority, while your half-brother, technically illegitimate, was being hailed as a brilliant general. It didn't do wonders for family harmony. And then there's the darker side, illegitimate children as threats. A king might use them against rivals, but rivals could also use them against the king. An ambitious noble could prop up a royal bastard as a pretender, claiming that the throne should have been his all along. This was rare, but it happened often enough to make kings uneasy, which is why many rulers walked a fine line. Recognize your bastards enough to keep them loyal, but not enough to make them dangerous. It was dynastic management at its most delicate, like balancing a candle on a barrel of gunpowder. And sometimes, bastards weren't just pawns, they became symbols. In political propaganda, enemies would point to a rival's bastards as proof of his moral corruption. Or they would hint, rather unkindly, that even the heir to the throne might secretly be illegitimate. In other words, your bastards weren't just children. They were walking vulnerabilities. The irony is that kings often fathered them in droves anyway. Because if history proves anything, it's that medieval rulers were much better at creating dynastic problems than solving them. But perhaps the most fascinating use of illegitimate children was in dynastic bargaining. A king negotiating with a rebellious noble might offer him land, money, or the hand of his illegitimate daughter. The noble would then be tied to the crown by family, even if his new bride came with fewer legal rights. It was a political gift, wrapped in scandal, but useful nonetheless. Sometimes these marriages worked surprisingly well. An illegitimate princess, married to a loyal baron, might find herself respected, even cherished, because, in the end, land and titles mattered more than birth, and everyone, from peasants to kings, was constantly recalculating the balance between shame and advantage. So, when we think of medieval bastards, we shouldn't just imagine tragic figures skulking in shadows. We should also picture them as tools sometimes sharpened into weapons, sometimes dulled into harmlessness. They were part of the messy machinery of medieval politics, disposable in theory, but in practice often essential. And so, illegitimacy was never just a private matter. It was public, political, and deeply woven into the way power worked. A bastard could be hidden, scorned, or married off, but sooner or later they ended up on the game board. Next time, let's drift into the moral debates and sermons around illegitimacy, because if there was one thing medieval clerics loved almost as much as Latin grammar, it was telling people their children were sinful. Hey everyone, welcome back. We've drifted through royal scandals, village secrets, and political maneuvers. Now it's time to step into the echoing stone halls of the medieval church. Because while families struggled to hide illegitimate children, priests and theologians were very busy making sure everyone felt guilty about it. Illegitimacy, in the eyes of the church, was not just a social inconvenience. It was a moral stain, a visible reminder that someone, somewhere, had committed a sin. And naturally, the church made it their business to keep that stain front and center. The starting point was canon law. The church decreed that illegitimate children could not inherit clerical positions, land tied to church institutions, or certain rights. The idea was simple. Sin should not lead to privilege, but in practice, this caused endless loopholes, exceptions, and headaches, because what do you do if the king's illegitimate son wants to become a bishop? You can't exactly say no. So, dispensations were invented. Special papal permissions, allowing bastards to hold positions they were technically barred from. It was a tidy solution. Morality remained on parchment, while reality carried on in the streets. Sermons, though, were much harsher. Priests thundered from pulpits about the dangers of fornication. They warned that children born outside wedlock carried the shame of their parents. Some even claimed illegitimate children were more likely to become criminals. It was less theology and more village gossip dressed in Latin. And yet, there's something oddly contradictory here. The same church that condemned illegitimate births also baptized the children, welcomed them into the parish, and occasionally raised them in orphanages. Sin was denounced, but sinners, especially tiny ones, were still reluctantly cared for. Monastic writers loved to use illegitimacy as a metaphor. A king who misruled was described as a bastard of justice. corrupt bishop was born of illegitimacy. It was a handy insult, ready to be applied in almost any quarrel. And of course, irony was never far away. Many priests and monks, despite their vows, fathered children themselves. Records of disciplinary councils are full of complaints about clerics with mistresses and illegitimate offspring. The rules existed, but like most rules, they were far better at being broken. Universities added their own spin. Scholars debated whether illegitimate children carried inherited sin. Could they, through baptism, be fully cleansed? Or would the shadow of their birth always cling to them? Opinions varied, but the debates always circled back to the same point. Illegitimacy was proof of humanity's weakness, a reminder that even kings and bishops couldn't keep their passions in check, which, in a way, was convenient for the church. It reinforced their message. Everyone sins, and only the church can offer redemption. What's striking is how public shame and private reality diverged. Publicly, illegitimacy was condemned. Privately, it was tolerated. Everyone knew someone who had an illegitimate child. Everyone gossiped about them, but few families were untouched by it. It's almost as if medieval society functioned on two levels. The level of sermons, where sin was thundered against, and the level of daily life, where compromises were made quietly, behind closed doors. By the later Middle Ages, this tension was beginning to soften. Kings legitimized children more often. The papacy handed out dispensations liberally. Communities became slightly less scandalized, partly because illegitimacy was so common. It was hard to keep pointing fingers without three pointing back, but the stain never quite disappeared. Even today, the word bastard carries centuries of insult behind it, a medieval issue still whispering. So, where does this leave us? We've wandered through castles, courts, cottages, and cloisters. We've seen illegitimate children hidden, shamed, married off, turned into bishops, or left at church doors. We've seen them wielded as pawns, rise as conquerors, and survive as nameless orphans. Illegitimacy in the medieval world was not one story, but many. For some, it was a curse that haunted their lives. For others, it was merely a hurdle irritating, but conquerable. And for kings, it was often both a scandal and a convenient political tool. As you drift into sleep, perhaps that's the final thought to hold. Illegitimacy in the Middle Ages was never truly hidden. It was always there, in whispers, in documents, in the very fabric of dynastic politics. Condemned from pulpits, yet lived out in cottages. Shamed in law, yet woven into royal bloodlines. A contradiction, a secret everyone knew, and, like so much of history, something both deeply human and quietly absurd.